Good morning, everyone. My name is Allan Needell. I'm curator in the National Air and Space Museum's Division of Space History with the responsibility for the Apollo collection. We're here at the National Air and Space Museum in our Moving Beyond Earth gallery. And we're here to discuss a book called Falling to Earth, which Smithsonian Books has released at just the time, 40 years after the flight of Apollo 15. The subtitle of the book is An Apollo 15 Astronaut's Journey to the Moon. And we are very, very pleased to have with us the command module pilot for that mission, Al Worden.
Thanks. First, it's my pleasure to be here. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Smithsonian for publishing the book. And thirdly, welcome to the Al and Al Show.
And just let me say to you that I've had the privilege of being able to read the book, and I enjoyed the book tremendously. And I want to thank you and your co-author for the job that you did.
Yeah, I'd like to introduce the co-author. Francis French is sitting down in front here. Actually, he did the work on this book. All I had to do was talk. And as most people know, that's not something that's difficult for me to do. So I did a lot of talking. He did a lot of recording. He did a lot of transcribing, and he did a lot of writing on the book. So I owe Francis a big debt of gratitude for this book, because I think he did a wonderful job on it. And I guess we'll talk about the book a little bit as we go here. But
well, let me start by for the only time I'm going to do this, I'm going to read a half of a sentence from the book, and it says, I grew up in a place that was about as far away from the high-tech world as it's possible to imagine. And that was in rural Michigan.
yes.
The question I wanted to ask is, you do talk about in the book self-reliance and about working on cars and about solitude and independence and learning to do that. Much has been made about your role as a command module pilot of being the most isolated person in the universe. And there's some discussion in the book about the relationship
I'm not sure about the universe, Alan. I think
that's true.
You know, there may be somebody else out there.
More isolated.
Something out there that could be more isolated. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Point well taken. But the question still remains, you hint that there may be a relationship to the comfort you had with being in that position of being isolated in the command module and your upbringing. And I wonder if you'd talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I think there probably is. I think it's a personality characteristic that you develop based on how you grow up and the environment in which you grow up. My early years really revolved around the farm. Every summer I went to my grandfather's farm. He was believe it or not, my grandfather was a homesteader in Michigan. He came. He's a wetback, okay? I call lots of people wetbacks, but can be from anywhere. My granddad was a wetback from Canada. He never went through the official steps to become an American citizen. He just walked across the border. And when he got to a little town in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan, he staked out 160 acres and went down to the land office and signed all the paperwork, and it became his farm, 160 acres. He spent his lifetime clearing that land, building a house, building a barn, digging a well. He was a very, very competent individual who could do just about anything. Had his own little blacksmith shop. So he took care of everything. He always had a team of horses. And one of the things I found out very early on is that animals don't take care of themselves very well. You have to be the one to take care of them. If the cow's going to be milked, you're the one going to do it. If they have to be let out to pasture, you got to do it. They don't do these things for themselves. So I guess what I'm saying is at a very early age, I learned a sense of responsibility that I would not have gotten any other way. And that is to take care of those around you and those who work with you and for you, be they dumb animals or people. It doesn't make any difference. But you develop that sort of sense of responsibility. Also on the farm, you're out there in the field all day long by yourself with a team of horses. And you learn that the solitude and the great outdoors and the beauty of where you are is all you need. And it's great. And you're very comfortable in your own skin being by yourself. And I kind of grew up that way. Then I became a fighter pilot in the Air Force, which is a single seat fighter pilot, and I was very comfortable doing that. Actually, I didn't really want to be too responsible for anybody else. If something going to happen, I'd rather it just be me. So again, that's that individual thing where you learn kind of to take care of yourself, and you don't worry about being alone.
But there's an interesting contrast, because you also emphasize in the book, especially later on in your career, how much teamwork is important, and that we don't accomplish anything unless we work together, and that there's rules and there's organization and there's responsibilities which are shared. Where did that come in? It came in the Air Force?
That's an interesting question. Yes, it takes a tremendous amount of teamwork to get one of these flights off and do your thing and come back successfully. It's interesting in the way the teams were organized. Every Apollo flight that landed on the moon had a commander and a lunar module pilot. The commander was responsible for landing the lunar module down to the surface, taking it down and landing it. The lunar module pilot was responsible for watching all the instruments. He was kind of the systems engineer all the way to the moon, and then he was the commander's co-pilot on the way down to the surface. He still watched the instruments more than he actually flew anything. The command module pilot kind of he's all by himself. The command module pilot takes the crew from Earth to the moon. He drops them off when they're ready to go down to the surface. He stays in orbit by himself, and then he picks them up at the end of all that, and you come home. Now, there's a lot of teamwork going out and coming back that the entire crew is involved in, but the command module pilot basically trains by himself, because what we trained for more than anything else was, believe it or not, rendezvous and docking. That's the thing in everybody's mind. When you land on the moon and you come back up into orbit, man, that's just seems like a really, really scary thing. So you spend a lot of time talking about rendezvous and docking to make sure that you've got everything under control and you can dock with the lunar module and bring everybody back home. So yes, there's a lot of teamwork, but I found that I did a lot of my training by myself.
Reading the book, one gets to understand that the teamwork between the crew is really only a small part of the teamwork. For instance, you talk about your experiences working with the workers, the blue-collar workers in North American aviation who are building a ship that's going to take you, and the relationship and the trust that you had to build with them. So it's not just it's just the three of you. It's a whole lot
Another
more.
good point. My first job when I got to Houston, after we'd gone through the initial training program, I was assigned as a support crew for Apollo, well, actually it turned out to be Apollo 8, but Apollo 8 was supposed to be the first lunar Earth orbital checkout, Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweikert. Well, the lunar module didn't get ready in time, so they reassessed what they were doing, and they sent Apollo 8 to the moon, as you all know, with Frank Borman. My job was to go to North American Rockwell and Downey and follow the spacecraft through its final assembly and checkout. I did that, and by doing that, I got to meet all the technicians who were actually putting this thing together. And I found that there's a magic connection that occurs when you get to know the guys who are actually building it. I would walk into the clean room in the morning, and the technicians who were putting the spacecraft together were, they're around, they're here and there and other places. And I would find out from them what went on the night before, and if there were any problems, if there was a glitch, if there was something they couldn't resolve. And I found out basically before the program managers did, because I was on name basis with these guys. In fact, I got to tell you, we were so close to the technicians, we actually organized a baseball game against them at one point. So we had fun with these guys. They were great guys. They were very, very competent at what they did, engineers, technicians, and all of them. And I got on a personal basis with them to find out anything that could be a little off in the spacecraft. And I think that really paid off. I think Apollo 8 had the fewest in-flight problems of any of the lunar flights. And I think that's because I knew all these guys, and they were all friends. And it's not just we're fixing a spacecraft to send to the moon. It's that we're fixing a spacecraft for Al Worden to go to the moon, and we're going to make sure that everything on that spacecraft is the way it's supposed to be. And I think that was very important. And I think that's also kind of the outgrowth of the way I grew up.
Well, let's go back, just try to keep a little bit chronology. As a historian, it's a weakness, this chronology guides probably too much of what I think about. But the next step in the career to become an Air Force, to go to West Point,
right,
was a major, major decision. It didn't seem to be one that was sort of foreordained, and it seemed to be almost serendipitous.
It was not at first. I never thought about it.
Right.
I had a scholarship from high school to go to Princeton. And a couple of months before I was supposed to go, they did a recheck on my records and found that I had not taken Latin in high school. And that was something they required. So that scholarship went by. My principal then got me a scholarship to the University of Michigan, and so I went down there for a year. It was quite obvious. I grew up in a family of 6 kids. My father just worked in town, had a regular job. He was a projectionist at the local theater. Did not make a lot of money. Could not afford to send me to college. Full shot. They could help a little bit. So it became obvious that I had to do something to complete. Either had to go to work or find some way to go to college that didn't cost me anything. I had a very good friend, a classmate of mine, whose brother had gone to the Coast Guard Academy. And I was over talking to he and his dad one day, and his dad said, "Hey, you're perfect. You should apply to the academy. And don't just pick one, apply to all of them. Don't just say military or Navy or whatever. Put your application out there for all." So I did. We had 2 senators. Some of you older folks in the audience will probably remember some of these people. But we had 2 senators from Michigan who were quite well known at the time. It was Senator Homer Ferguson and Senator Vandenberg. And a local congressman. Went to the local congressman, and he says, "Well, the first thing you got to do is take this competitive exam. It's a civil service exam, and anybody who wants to go to any of the academies needs to take this competitive exam. And then we're going to, the senators and congressmen will pick off that exam, doing background checks and all that kind of stuff, as who's going to go." So I took the competitive exam, and I got the results back, I think, in December. I got an appointment from Homer Ferguson to go to West Point in like January. I knew I was going to go there the next June. Guess what happened to my studies at the University of Michigan at that point? I had a great spring semester. Made several trips, went skiing, did a lot of things. Anyway, in June then I went to West Point because that was my, and I thought I was going to be an Army officer. I was going to be the guy leading the troops up the hill with the enemy shooting at you and all that. That was my big goal.
You mentioned that your experience with aviation before then was just one plane that you saw landed in one of the fields.
That's right, Alan. Before I went to West Point, I had one airplane ride, and that was the flight from Detroit to New York to go to West Point. That was my complete experience with airplanes. While I was at West Point, though, it's really interesting. The reason I decided not to go Army and to go Air Force instead was that I had 2 very, very interesting tactical officers that I was very close to while I was at West Point. Again, The old folk, you people would know. You people might. Back in the late 40s, the Army football team was probably the most powerful team in the country. We had Doc Blanchard and Glenn Davis, and not too many people remember who the quarterback was. Anybody here know? Can you remember?
Way before my time.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, that quarterback was my tactical officer. And he was very, very powerful. The other tactical officer I had was, Arnold Tucker was his name, by the way, if anybody remembers. My other tactical officer was a fellow by the name of Jim Allen, who ended up becoming the commander-in-chief of SHAEF, and then he became the superintendent of the Air Force Academy. So he was a very, very smart guy. They talked me into going to the Air Force. And by then I'd had a little experience in an airplane, so I knew what it was all about. But I had not a clue that airplanes and me were a good match until I went to pilot training.
One aspect that I think actually reflects experiences later on as well is you talk about the generational differences that you found among the older officers at West Point and their emphasis on the ground activity, and then the new guys who were coming in with academic training and book smarts.
Well, at West Point, of course, that's an Army academy, so you get a lot of ground training. We had a lot of interaction with officers who had been in World War II. In fact, one of our political science professors, Colonel Ware, was a Medal of Honor winner from World War II. A very, very famous episode in World War II where he called in his fire on his own position because they were being overrun. Saved his company. And then we had Iron Mike Michaelis, who was the commandant at the time. He was very famous in World War II. He was the head of the 82nd Airborne Division. And he was famous because all he wanted to do during the war was jump out of airplanes. And they had to restrain him from jumping out of airplanes. But he led the first attack behind the lines. He was the 82nd or the 101st, I forget now which it was. But these were the kind of guys we had. The superintendent was Blackshear Bryan, who had just come back from Korea. And he was an Army guy through and through and through and through. So it was kind of a departure from West Point to actually decide to go in the Air Force back in those days. But it was the right move for me.
But you trained by learning engineering, and you trained by learning...
Well, yes. Well, you mean at West Point?
At West Point.
At West Point, we got a degree called the Bachelor of Military Science. Right. Whatever that means. But we did get some engineering, we got some math, we got all those other courses, but we also did the military science thing, military history and topography and graphics and that kind of thing. So I had kind of a partial engineering background when I left West Point, which I expanded on later at the University of Michigan.
But the same tensions later on in the Air Force, as once you were on active duty there, existed to some degree, I take it, with the older generations and the younger generations who are actually learning.
Well, what I found when I got into a squadron, and in fact I flew for 6 years right out of Andrews here, and the 95th Fighter Squadron, and we were considered the defenders of the nation's capital, and I always thought that was a joke because we could hardly get an airplane off the ground back in those days. We'd never had the parts. So it was very difficult to get an airplane off the ground. But when I got to the squadron, what I found was that the flight commanders and up from there in our squadron were by and large guys who'd flown in World War II. At the end of World War II, they were busted back to sergeant. And then when the Korean War came along, they got reactivated as officers. And the problem was that in World War II, they flew piston engine airplanes, Now in our squadron, we're flying F-86 jets. So these guys had to go back through a retraining program to fly jet airplanes, and some of them didn't make that transition too well. They were very, very afraid of the jet airplane, and a little bit shaky in what they did. But yet, these were the guys that were evaluating me and how I was doing, and very few of them had college education at all, any college training. They were mostly high school graduates. And here comes 3 or 4 guys into the squadron as second lieutenants who are West Point graduates, and that didn't set well with these guys. So there was always that little bit of friction in the squadron. And,
So I think I'm stretching it a little bit, but I was thinking about the parallel of when you're in the Astronaut Corps and the various, you were in the 5th class to come in.
Right.
There were earlier guys who had a lot of experience. There were other people who were coming in with that. And then behind you were the scientist-trained astronauts. And
well,
I'm wondering
there was
if
a group of scientists just before us. Group 4 was more or less a science group too. But you're right. When we well, I'll tell you the story. When I first showed up down in Houston, there were 19 of us that got selected, and they broke us down into various flights. And I was assigned to a guy by the name of Wally Schirra. He was my flight commander, flight leader. And I walked into his, now he was a Navy captain and I was an Air Force captain. So I figured, oh, what the hell, we're all equal. So I walked in and I said, yeah, it's nice to meet you, and I'm a captain and you're a captain, and that's great. That didn't sit well with Wally. The next thing I found myself doing was getting him a cup of coffee. But I got to tell you, he's maybe the greatest friend I've ever had. He was a wonderful guy, and we became very close friends. There was this attitude in the program, and it's like anywhere. It's like your first days in school, your first days in college, your first days in flight training, your first days here. You're kind of the outsider at first until somebody takes pity on you and they kind of bring you into whatever the group is. And I found that everywhere. When I got to the Astronaut Corps down in Houston, what I found is you got to earn your spurs. I don't care where you are, you got to earn the respect of everybody else. So what we found when we first got to Houston was that, hey, you're the greenie. You're the guy who sweeps the floor. You're the guy who gets the coffee. And by and by, you'll learn a few things here and there, and sooner or later, you'll get on a support crew and then a backup crew, and maybe you'll get your own flight.
Reminded you of West Point.
Absolutely at West Point. The first year at West Point is pure hell, because you got upperclassmen who are bracing you in a corner and yelling and screaming at you all the time, and you're nothing. You're just dirt. Once you get through that first year, what a wonderful world it became after I got through the first year, because I didn't have anybody screaming at me anymore. So yeah, you gotta earn it.
Now, the first interaction you had with astronauts was when you were still in the Air Force at Edwards. I believe some of them would come up and train there.
Right.
What was your impression of the astronauts when you weren't an astronaut?
Well, I have to tell you, my hero, even at Edwards when I was there, my hero and the guy that I hoped to follow was always Mike Collins. And a lot of you know Mike Collins quite well. He was the guy that I always hoped to be. There were others. I taught a simulator at the test pilot school. It was a space simulator. And we had guys come out from Houston that were going to do spacewalks, extravehicular activities, come out and train on our system. Charlie Bassett and Gene Cernan were the two that came out. And so I got a chance to meet them and realized that these guys were really exceptional. They picked stuff up like that, piece of cake. They really understood this business about being in space and being in neutral gravity or weightlessness or zero gravity, if you want to call it. There's no such thing as zero gravity. We all talk about zero gravity, but you realize there is no such thing as zero gravity, ever, anywhere. I don't care where you go. You're either under the gravity influence of the Earth or the Moon or the Sun or something else, but there's always a large body out there that its gravity is affecting you and any vehicle you're in. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's part of it too. But these guys came out and trained on this simulator for their spacewalks, mm-hmm. and I found that they were just mm-hmm. they picked it up like that, and they knew exactly what we're talking about. No problems at all.
Now it's easy for us when we think about Apollo to just think about it as the sort of self-contained or the space mm-hmm. program. But it wasn't. It was immersed in a historical period. And at Edwards, if you hadn't what would have become of you had you decided not to apply or had not been accepted into the Astronaut Corps?
I think I probably would have taught for another year or two at the test pilot school or at the Advanced Aerospace Research Pilot School. I probably would have had a tour in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And I would have come back and either go back to Edwards in flight test or picked up a squadron or something of all-weather fighters somewhere. Mm-hmm. But I think there was a progression there that if I hadn't gone into the program, mm-hmm. would have been kind of a normal Air Force progression.
There was one other sort of pre-NASA thing that struck me as interesting in your book, and that was your discussion of the year or so you spent in England, and mm-hmm. the comparison you made between the way that we did things automated and mm-hmm.
Here
and how self-directed things were, that you took your own notes, you did your own analysis, you did your mm-hmm. own measurements. I wonder if you'd talk about that.
When you read the book, you'll find out that I went through test pilot school in England back in the 60s, and the school was called the Empire Test Pilot School. And it was a funny thing because the British still considered us part of the Empire. We had to dissuade them on numerous occasions from that, but we were considered part of the Empire. There were four of us, two Navy and two Air Force guys from here, from the U.S., were over there on exchange duty. And I went over and went through the test pilot school over there. What Allan's referring to is a feeling, is my understanding of all that. Back in those days, we were flying World War II airplanes. We were flying, Hawker Hunter wasn't exactly a World War II airplane, but a Meteor was. A Meteor was a twin-engine jet airplane that was built by England and flew right at the end of World War II. Non-pressurized, very dangerous airplane flight. But this is when the point we're getting to is none of these airplanes were instrumented as we would do it here in this country. When you flew a program of flight test on one of those airplanes, you had to take a ruler, a handheld force gauge, anything you needed to measure, you had to stick it in your pocket and take it with you so that you could measure all these things in flight. Now, the advantage of that was that when I got back to the classroom, I had to reduce all that data, and I had to understand what it all meant because I had taken it, I had recorded all this stuff manually. So I had to understand what it was about the airplane that I was trying to show, and I didn't have somebody in the back room analyzing all the data that was collected in some room somewhere where the pilot is only flying the airplane. And I thought that was a tremendous advantage to me because it forced me to understand the systems, forced me to understand the aerodynamics, forced me to understand everything there was to know about the airplane. And I thought that was really, really important. And when I got into the program then, that same thing applied to the command module.
Well, we should probably, since we've spent a lot of time, actually talk about some of your experiences mm-hmm. Going into space. The mission that you were on was the first of the missions that was less a engineering test mission than it was an actual exploration scientific mission. Can you talk a little bit about the training, your familiarity, what the issues were, and what your goals were for the mission?
Yeah, we were the first of what we called the J missions. The J mission, everything was uprated. because we were carrying a lot of extra weight with us. The lunar rover, I forget exactly how much it weighed, but it's like 500 pounds somewhere. And we carried the scientific instrument module into lunar orbit, which had a large, that's kind of interesting, had a large high-resolution camera designed in the 50s. We had a mapping camera with a laser altimeter associated with it. We carried a series of remote sensing devices that we would put out on collapsing pole. We'd run the pole out with a sensor at the end so that nothing around the spacecraft would interfere with the data we're collecting. This is the first time that had been done. And so we were fairly confident in flying the machinery at that point. So the last year and a half of training, we really focused on the science. And the whole thing about going to the moon is you got to study geology. Interesting. What do we call study rocks here on Earth?
Geology.
What do we call study rocks on the moon?
Geology.
Bingo. We're really, really smart people, right? We call the study of rocks on the moon geology. Makes me think when we get to Mars, we're going to probably call the study of rocks on Mars geology. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how far we're going to carry that. But we really focused on the geology. Now, Dave and Jim spent days and days studying geology in various locations around the world, actually, where there were features that were very lunar-like. Craters and lava flows and calderas and all kinds of things. While they were doing that, I was working with Farouk Elbaz, studying lunar geology, which meant that I was looking at the large features. I wasn't looking at micro stuff like individual rocks. I was looking at large features and in an attempt to integrate those large features with what we found on the surface so that we kind of understood the processes and how these things got there. So we really focused on the science.
It sounds to me from reading the book that you were always at peace with this idea that you were going to go to the moon, but these other two guys were going to go walk around, and you were going to get to stay up there and do this other aspects of the exploration.
Right. Well, I was very happy. People often ask, how do you happen to be a command module pilot or lunar module pilot or commander? I think it's, it was true back then that the best way to become a commander is to be a command module pilot first. Mm-hmm. And it's a very logical sequence. As a command module pilot, you learn everything about the command service module. And then there's Farouk. If you become a commander, you've only got one vehicle to learn, and that's the lunar module. If you're a lunar module pilot, unfortunately, a lunar module pilot doesn't get to fly anything. He's looking at all the instruments. So he's got to learn two vehicles to fly, and that's only one guy in the program did that, and that's Gene Cernan. All the other commanders were old CMPs, if you will. We got selected for the seats that we had based on our experience. And I was out in Downey all the time, checking out the spacecraft that would become Apollo 8 when we had the fire at the Cape. And I got a call from Deke in Houston saying they had this tragedy, and for me to get, I think Tom Stafford and John Young and Gene Cernan, I think were all out there. So I told them, we all went back to Houston. What happened after that, they formed a committee to go back and redo all the fire safety aspects of the command module. Well, since I knew so much about it already, that was, I was there. I was, didn't even have to be asked. Jim Irwin got assigned to the crew that looked after the LEM. So when the flight assignments come up, it was pretty obvious I was going to be a command module pilot.
You mentioned Farouk Elbaz. I think people may not know that Farouk was here at the museum when it was first opened, and he started our Center for Earth and Planetary Studies.
Yes.
So we're familiar with him, and he's quite a character. Let me ask you about one question. I know that it's this question about how much did you think about the danger and whether you might have to come back alone?
I could give you a flip answer, but I won't. You know, it's always in the back of your mind, but it's like the more you train for something and the more you know about it, the more comfortable you are doing it. So we never, the issue of not coming back, we didn't take poison pills, folks, by the way. And none of that nonsense that you've maybe heard about. The most dangerous part of the flight would be if Dave and Jim couldn't get off the surface. That's where we could have had a problem. If the engine misfired or something happened and they couldn't get off, then yes, I'd have to come home by myself. I have to say, I kind of held that over their head too, saying, hey guys, you know, don't forget, I can still go home, which was something that they had to think about. But we never really, you know, in terms of being concerned or nervous or really worried about that sort of thing, I don't think we ever were. And our flight went so flawlessly anyway, that we never even, I mean, it wasn't even a thought.
Well, backing up just one other aspect I learned actually from your book is how early you were aware that that the degree of support, the financial support for the Apollo program was not going to last forever, that they were already canceling flights.
Correct.
Which must have upped the ante in the sense that, look, we've already invested all of this stuff. We better really get our money's worth out of the remaining missions.
Well, I think that's part of it, Alan. I think mentally, when you make a flight like this to the moon, you're going to be there for 6 days. You're going to be on the flight for up to 13 days. You're only going to go that way once. You're never going back. You better do every single thing you can while you're there. So you don't overlook anything. Kind of interesting. In the flight plan, normally there's a certain number of scientific experiments that you do. And there's, you know, I don't know how there's never any official number, but let's say on a normal flight, there's a 100%, you figure a number that's 100%. We had principal investigators and scientists asking us to do things for them that went beyond that, and we accepted all those. So we actually planned for like 125% of what would be a normal scientific load, with the understanding that it's always easier to take something out of a flight plan than it is to put something in. We were so dedicated to getting everything we could while we were there, we did everything. We did them all.
Now, all of the work that you did, or a great part of it, not all of it, but a great part of it depended on getting that data from the sim bay of the service module, that is the film from all of the work that you had done. And one of the unique parts, and I think you still hold the record of the deepest space EVA, is that true? Why don't you talk a little bit about your impressions of that?
I think we still have the record for the furthest out spacewalk to recover that film. Interestingly, that the high-resolution camera was a camera that was originally developed for the U-2 back in the 50s. In fact, all the equipment we had on board was basically late 1950s design, build, you know, and the point of that was that we wanted to make sure that whatever we carried was very, very reliable. And so this stuff was tested to the nth degree over the years until we were really, really comfortable that it was good. That high-resolution camera, which is the old U-2 camera, had something like 1,100 feet of 8-inch film, I think it was, in a big canister, which weighed about 90 pounds. So the whole idea of the spacewalk was that you get out of the spacecraft, you work your way to the back end of the service module, you take that canister and pull it out of its camera, and you bring it back in, you put it inside the command module, because the only thing that survives the flight are those things which are inside the command module, like us, right? In addition to the camera. And then I had to go back out and get the film canister from the mapping camera and do the same thing. That was an interesting experience. Talk about overtraining. I had trained so much for that spacewalk and that EVA that I completed the whole thing less time than I was supposed to, and then I couldn't figure out a good excuse to stay out longer because I'd done everything. So they're all saying, get back in, get back in. I'm thinking, I was out there, 38 minutes?
And you didn't have your smartphone camera with you.
And I did not have a camera. I wanted to carry a camera out there because you never know what you're going to see. It could be all kinds of things. Well, turns out there were some things that should have been photographed that really weren't. It's like the scorching of the outside of the service module where the reaction control system rockets, when they fired, they were scorching and blistering the Mylar covering on the outside of the service module. I don't think anybody had been aware of that before, and it probably made, when they found that out, it caused a few changes. But you never know, what you're going to see when you're out there. The wonderful part of it is I could stand up on the outside of the service module and look and see both the Earth and the Moon. And that's kind of a unique place to be.
You could tell that Al and Al could go on and on and on, but why don't we invite people to step up to the mic and ask questions. If somebody there will moderate, and if not, we'll just go on. So if anyone's interested, please make your way to the microphone by the spotlight there, and that won't beam you up, Scotty, but it's just a nice microphone for it. Oh, and you'll have to hand in your permission slips on the way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Don't forget you're on live TV.
First of all, it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you. After your return to Earth, what was the greatest adjustment you had to make?
What's what? What is it?
Good question. He said, what was the greatest adjustment you had to make after you returned to Earth?
Getting used to crowds of people. That was the big thing. You make a flight the last 2 weeks, there's only 3 of you. Nobody else around. You get back, you go through debriefing, and then the president sends you on a world tour. And all you're doing is talking to big crowds of people all the time. And everybody wants to buy you a drink, and this and that and the other thing. And that's a big adjustment.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
First, I wanted to say I really admire your work with the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation. I know you devote a lot of time and effort to that worthy group, and thank you very much for doing that. Can you tell us, when you were conducting interviews and doing other research for the writing of this book, was there anything that you learned for the first time, 40 years after the event, something that you were maybe surprised to find out about?
I don't think so. I relearned a few things. With the passage of time, 40 years goes by. It's not the 40 years. It's the fact that 40 years ago I started out at 40, now I'm 40 years older. And it's the last 10 years where I'm probably missing a few connections here and there. So things I don't remember. There are some things that we had to kind of dig up. And Francis is very, very good at asking the right question. And so you start out with a question, and that triggers something, and you go down that path, and that triggers another question. And I'm sure you get this all the time here. And pretty soon, a lot of it comes back. And we spend a lot of time rehashing stuff like that to make sure that we said it correctly.
Related to that, while someone is I wonder if you'd comment a little bit about the degree of tension between the astronaut as a person, a family man, someone with their hobbies and individual interests, and working for NASA, the autonomy versus the structure that you found at JSC, and how that changed over the years.
Well, it was funny. When I was at JSC, there wasn't a really firm style or discipline or regimentation. Back in those days, I'm always glad I flew back then. Back in those days, everybody had a goal. One goal, and that was it. Every single person at the old Manned Spacecraft Center, or now the Johnson Spacecraft Center. One goal, that's to get a guy on the moon and get him back home. Everybody lived to that. Outside of that, we weren't a number. We were people. We were basically left to our own devices to do whatever needed to be done. And some of us trained exceptionally hard, worked exceptionally hard to understand all the things we had to do. And I think there was a range of interest in doing all that. But there's not a lot of regimentation. This was self-imposed kind of stuff. A little different than family, where you know, you're more concerned about the people than what you're doing.
From a little person here.
How did the Earth look from the moon?
How did the Earth look from the moon? Is that the question?
Yes.
Looks like a big marble. Big blue and white marble. And it's hard to imagine that that's home. That's where we live. Big. It's bigger than the moon from here.
How do you respond to folks that say we're not alone in the universe?
How do I respond to the comment about we're not alone in the universe? I agree with it. How could you not? Universe is a pretty big place. One of the most impressive things that I saw when I was on the flight was the universe from the dark side of the moon. There is as you know, the back side of the moon is different from the dark side. Does everybody agree with that? When you're shadowed from both the sun and the earth, then you're really in the dark side. There was a pie-shaped section of the orbit where I was over the horizon from both the earth and the sun. And that made a huge difference in the universe. Instead of seeing 37 of the brightest stars, which were our navigation stars, I saw a sheet of light. Hundreds of thousands of millions more stars than we can see from here. That gets you thinking about things. We're part of the Milky Way galaxy. This is a little off the book, but we're part of the Milky Way galaxy. We're about 2/3 the way out from the center of the galaxy. We look at the galaxy through, and that's why we see the Milky Way, because we're looking through this galaxy. Last count I heard of the numbers of stars in the Milky Way exceeded 200 billion in our own galaxy. And there are about the same number of galaxies out there. Are we unique? I cannot believe, with the billions and trillions of stars out there, that there's not another Earth out there and somebody's living there.
Let me ask
Can't
you,
believe that.
In that
Yeah.
same vein, we hear from other astronauts that the experience of actually seeing with your own eyes some of these things is something that can't be replicated either by the Hubble Space Telescope pictures. Is that true? I mean, is there a unique aspect of actually physically looking at it, or do you get the same feeling for looking at the Hubble images?
Oh, that's interesting. No, I think I never thought about it before, but I do think there's a psychological or emotional component, probably coupled with the fact that you're 250,000 miles away from home, that has a huge impact on you, much more so than just looking at a picture that the Hubble took.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity to be here and ask you a question, but I want to give you a fact before I ask the question. You were my boss in 1959 at Andrews Air Force Base in the 95th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, and one of the best bosses I ever had, I'm glad to say. I know at that time you probably didn't have any idea you were going to be an astronaut, am I correct?
Thank you.
And
God, that's a long time ago.
that's a long time ago. You're right. My question really is, do you think that we will go forward in the near future with another type of an astronaut program to some place, a destination that we probably haven't heard about yet, or maybe we've heard about it, but we haven't had serious conversation about it yet?
Did everybody get the question? Okay. I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. I think we've really put the brakes on. I think it's sad. I think we're lacking leadership in this country today. I don't want to point any fingers, but how can you cancel the Constellation program? It may not even be the best program, but to just cancel it, I think, really harms this country. And it's going to be years and years and years before we're going to be able to recover the momentum to go back. Now, I know there are things on the drawing boards to just get people to the space station and back. The longer-term program to go somewhere else far away, I don't think we're going to see for 25 years at least. It'll be a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I think that's sad. It's not that exploration is the thing. It's that exploration by itself leads to things, and the byproduct of that is new technology. And I think, to me, the most critical part of that is the excitement that it brings to the country, the pride that it brings to the country, and the motivation it provides for students in school. I think you'll find that in the last 40 years, the greatest motivator for kids in school is the space program. Because every kid wants to be an astronaut or work there. Because it's exciting. When you kill that excitement, you kill a lot of motivation to do things like get yourself through school and be ready to take advantage of it.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Think we have time for a couple more?
Thank you for the presentation. Just to build upon the previous gentleman's question, so any thoughts or opinions on what you think should be done going forward in the future with regard to the space program?
What I think should be done. Yeah, I think we ought to triple the NASA budget. I think, that'd be the best expenditure of money this country could have. I think we ought to design some programs to go somewhere that's meaningful. I think we need to build propulsion systems that'll get us outside the solar system. I think we need to go find out where everybody else is living. That's a long-term project, but it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of resources. In the short term, I know we're getting launch vehicles ready to put astronauts up to the space station, either private or government. We're going to be looking a lot at private industry to do that. But the problem with private industry doing that is there's no profit in sending a flight to Mars. And so why would they do it? That's something that the government's got to do.
Yeah, I have two questions for Colonel Worden. The first one is, with the private spacecraft, would you favor a ballistic spacecraft like the Falcon or the winged spacecraft like the Dream Chaser?
I guess to answer your question, I guess I don't care. If you can get people up and people back safely, that's all I care about. I think Dream Chaser is probably, I don't know. Ballistic missile that splashes down in the ocean is the most efficient spacecraft you could build because you get the most volume for the least weight. It doesn't have wings, and they add weight. Dream Chaser is a lifting body type machine, and you can maneuver it and you can land somewhere. Probably overall, maybe a better choice, I don't know. But as far as I'm concerned, which way we go, I don't care, as long as it's safe.
My other question is, during your years in Houston, did you ever have the occasion to meet cardiologist Michael DeBakey?
No, I never did meet DeBakey. I met Cooley, but I never met DeBakey. We had our own cardiologist down at NASA, so we dealt with him.
Thank you much.
I think we have time for another one or two.
I was also
You're
wondering,
back.
could you tell us, was there anything that just because of space limitations you had to edit out that you wish you'd been able to keep and you could tell us about now? Something from the book you wish you could have elaborated on more?
You know, I honestly can't think of anything that would have been important to the book that's not there. I think Francis put this stuff together in an extremely good way, and we've been over it, you know, 1,000 times, and I think that the important stuff's all here. Thanks.
Okay.
That's a good question, though.
One more.
Okay, Bob.
I had a chance to speak to you
Is
earlier.
this a TV interview?
No,
Oh,
but
okay.
a question. Can you explain to everyone here the title of your book, what it means, so that they have an idea of what you've put on paper here?
Yeah. Okay, the title of the book, Falling to Earth, in my mind is has a double meaning. When you are at the moon and you start back to Earth, Earth's gravity pulls you in, and it pulls you towards Earth. It's exactly the same as if you got on the top of a cliff and you jumped off. And the gravity is going to make you fall all the way down, and the further you go, the faster you go. When you're coming back from the moon, the same thing happens. The gravity of Earth is attracting you, and you're accelerating, and you're literally falling into Earth. The important thing is that you not hit it. The important thing is that you hit the atmosphere at just the right angle so you can slow down and then use the parachutes to land. The other side of the title of the book is about what kind of happened after our flight, when we had a little problem with some postal covers and we got reprimanded, and I had to leave Houston. And that was a real fall for me. So it's kind of both those things.
All right, I think that's the time allotted now. I think you were all asked to sit here while Al makes his escape, but I wanted to thank you all for being such a great audience, and I want to, again, thank Al Worden.
Thanks, everybody.